Toronto condo investors are currently panic selling. Let's hop over the PC and go through some examples. All right, first up here, we have a unit on Blue Jays Way. It was purchased in 2022 for $2,050,000 and was just resold for $1.7 million, representing a loss of about 17%. And this one takes the cake. So out of all the examples I could find of people selling for less than they purchased, this was the biggest loss. Next up, we have a unit here in Humber Bay that was purchased for $850,000 again in 2022, and it was just resold for $737,737, a loss of 13%. This one was up there on the leaderboards as well. Then we get to this one on the Bay Street corridor, was just sold for $713,800 after previously being purchased for $795,000 at the peak of our market in 2022. Now, also worth noting here, if you go all the way back to 2007, you can see it was purchased for $289,000. Crazy to think about just how far prices have come over the last 15, 20 years, even with this recent, 15, 20% drawdown. Then we get to this unit here on the Esplanade, was purchased for $640,000 last year, was just resold a year later for $572,000, so about a 10% loss. And that's about what I'm seeing on average from last year to this year, about a 10% decrease in prices across the board for Toronto condos. Now, if you look at the amount of inventory on the MLS for listings across Toronto, so condos and freehold, you can see that we're running above seasonal target. In fact, we're seeing about the highest level of inventory that we've seen on the resale market since 2020. Condo inventory is actually leading the charge here. So freehold's holding up a little bit better than condos. So if you look at months of inventory, you can see that we're sitting around 6 months of inventory in Toronto for condos, which puts condos firmly in buyer's market territory, whereas freehold is not so much in buyer's market territory, right? Freehold is faring quite a bit better than condos in this current environment. And I think the reason for that is because condos are held more by investors than end users, specifically newer condos. So sort of 0 to 5 year old condos. You can see here that on average, those condos that are 0 to 5 years old are 60% held by investors. Now, if you were to go back to 2011, only 40% of those newly completed condos were held by investors. So in today's world, essentially pre-construction sales are predicated upon investors buying a large chunk of those units to then turn around and create rental inventory by renting those units out for 1 to 10 years after completion before they eventually sell those units onto the market and they get scooped up by end users. And without those investors participating largely in the pre-construction market, we would build far fewer homes. And I'll get to that later. Now, the reason in my view that so many investors are selling off their condos is just because of borrowing costs, right? So if you look at the average cash flow position of a Toronto condo investor from 2020 through 2022, you can see that before rates increased, we already went to a cash flow negative situation on average. So you can see here that in 2020, the average rent was $2,140 and your average carrying cost was just below that at $2,076. Contrast that with 2022, where your average rent rose to $2,457, but your average carry also rose to $2,680, making people about $200 a month negative cash flow. And that was 2022 before all of the rate hikes. So let's take a look at what it would look like today. Here's an example of a pre-construction purchase in 2018 that is closing now. So this is a 1-bed, 1-bath, 586 square feet in an amazing location. And it was sold for $740,000, so just under $1,300 a square foot. So you have 20% down on that, $148,000. Your mortgage at 6% on a 25-year term right now would be $3,788. Maintenance fees, $393 a month. Property taxes, $350. Your total is $4,531 a month, roughly. Now, I looked up the rents on this unit. I saw some examples going as high as 29, even $3,000 a month, but we're going to estimate on the low end here and assume you get $2,800 a month. Your net cash flow, right? Cash out of pocket every month after your expenses is $1,731. That is a lot of negative cash flow, right? Even after you adjust it for principal recapture, because obviously you're paying off a balance on your mortgage every month, but not that much at today's rates, you're looking at a adjusted cash flow of $844. But really, for most investors like this, the net cash flow on the monthly statement is what really matters because that's cash out of your pocket. Not every investor can afford to subsidize their renter to the tune of $1,700 a month. That is very aggressive. Now, I did the math just to show you how ludicrous this is. So break even is at a $2,057 a month mortgage payment, which would happen if rates went down to 0.5%. So your mortgage rate fell to 0.5%, which obviously is not going to happen. Or the purchase price instead of $740,000 was $500,000. Or of course, if you had the capital to, rather than have 20% down and $148,000 down, you top that up by another $240,000. And this is why a lot of people are just, selling their condos on assignment or selling their condos shortly after a building completes, just because they're looking at their monthly cash flow and they're going, you know what? I don't know if I want to make this long-term bet on the Toronto housing market. I don't know if I can afford to bleed cash while I make that bet. Just to give you a resale example here, here's that unit that we just looked at 25 the Esplanade. So your mortgage on this unit with 20% down would be $2,930 a month. Maintenance fees is $502, property taxes $188. So all in, you're at $3,620 a month. And that's at this price, right? The new price, today's price. Your rental income on this unit, based on the comps I looked at, is $2,600 a month. So your net cash flow, you're negative $1,000 a month, even on this cheap, $500,000 resale unit. Your principal recapture is $686. So your adjusted is a more manageable and reasonable $334 a month. But again, on a monthly basis, you're still subsidizing your renter to the tune of $1,000 a month. This might make sense if you're under the assumption real estate goes up always, or if you're looking for a 10, 15, 20-year hold. But really, when you look at the market and you look at the sentiment, right, I think most people think over the next 6, 12 months, prices continue to fall. And if you have that assumption, then, bleeding $1,000 a month just isn't going to feel like the right move. Now, obviously, rents are really high in Toronto. Condo rents are really high. They're rising really, really quickly. If you look at the 9-year average for rent values on Toronto condos on a per square foot basis, they are averaging 5.2% compounding annually. That is a really high rental appreciation, right? You look at a lot of places in the States, a lot of tier 1 cities in the States will average, 2.5 to 3.5% year over year in rental growth. We're averaging 5.24 here in Toronto, obviously because we just don't have enough housing supply for the inflow, the population growth. But regardless, the reason we're in this position is because actual prices of those condos have risen considerably faster. So rents are growing at 5.24% per year, but prices are growing at 7.9% per year, which just means that, of course, your cash flow position is going to get worse. And that's, of course, before accounting for the fact that interest rates have risen as quickly as they have. So if you're someone who is bleeding cash flow on a condo investment, look, we have one coming up that we paid 1.2 something for. Based on my math, occupancy fees are going to be like, $7,500, $8,000 a month. We're going to get about $4,500 a month in rent. So we're going to be cash flow negative to the tune of, $3,500 a month. It's not a positive position to be in, but it's not going to break us, right? And we're in it for the long term. So I think, if you're somebody who's in that position where you're like, I can afford to bleed $1,000 a month on my rental for, indefinitely, I just want to know what the long-term picture looks like. Well, the thing is, I really don't see a world where housing as a whole in the GTA, in Toronto, gets more affordable, given the fact that we are selling far fewer units than we would normally sell. So if you look at pre-sale launches this year, because again, a housing completion is predicated on a housing sale, and a housing sale is predicated on a launch, right? So you look at the launches this year, we launched 13,000 units, which is actually really low. It sounds like a lot of units, but it's nothing when you look at population inflow. Normally, we would see double that. So essentially 40 projects totaling 13,721 units that were expected to launch this year. Developers have decided not to launch them because of the current market. So if you fast forward, the average 5 or 6 year build cycle, that means that those 13,700 units that would have otherwise completed and been added to the housing stock are not going to be there, right? They are either going to be pushed farther in the future or yet to be launched. And that's, of course, bullish for price growth over, again, not the short term, right, but the long-term outlook. And of course, we just got this article recently that shows Canada is looking to stabilize immigration levels at $500,000 a year. So on the back of rapid increases in immigration targets, we aren't going to cut back. We are going to stabilize at the new levels. So again, we're underbuilding, critically underbuilding. Doesn't matter which report you're looking at. It's very clear that Toronto is vastly underbuilding housing supply. And of course, we're going to continue to do that, right? Yes, we have all these shiny new targets and all these incentives and all these things that we're trying to do. You get the 5% reduction on purpose-built rental. The reality is that actually only offsets the increase in borrowing costs on your construction loan. So it doesn't actually stimulate as much demand as they think it does. So realistically, again, it just comes down to a story of, if you can't afford to bleed $1,000 a month on your condo, which a lot of people can't, of course, selling makes sense, right? You shouldn't be losing sleep. You shouldn't be putting your family finances in a distressed situation in order to hold on to the hope that rate cuts are coming. But if you're someone who can afford to do it and you're looking at that 15-year time horizon, then I think it probably makes sense. It's probably a bet that pays off for you. It's a bet we're making. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you guys next video.